Okay, welcome to this meeting, this webinar of the International Macro History Online Seminar. I'm Tim Ganan. I'm going to be the Master of Ceremonies today, I guess. Before we begin, let me just remind you of the ground rules here for those of you who have not attended before. We will go from 11 until 11:40, during which time the speaker will just speak. There'll be no interruptions at that point. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function. Your chat has been disabled if you're an attendee. So use the Q&A function to write out questions. After 40 minutes, that part of the presentation will stop. And I will either ask you to state your own questions, or I'll just summarize if there's many questions that are similar. And then at 11 o'clock, we'll have a formal end to the proceedings, and we'll continue with another 15 minutes informally for those who would like to stick around. So let me just briefly introduce our speaker. We're very pleased to have, by the way, I've read the paper, it's a very interesting paper. We're very pleased to have Pavitra Suryanyan from Johns Hopkins University, who is actually speaking to us from New York in this wonderful age of Zoom. Nobody is where they really seem to be. So please take it away, Pavi.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to present at this seminar. Let me just pull up my presentation. Well, let me begin by saying that the paper that I've shared with you today is part of a larger book project that documents this, what I think of as a relatively curious phenomenon in our understanding of where state capacity comes from and how it comes to be strong or weak. And it's a phenomenon that I describe as hollowing out the state. So what exactly is entailed in hollowing out the state? In this paper, I make an argument that elites at specific moments in time deliberately undertake a tactic of weakening the state's fiscal capacity because elites anticipate future redistribution. And elites hollow out capacity in order to limit the prospect of future redistribution because they understand that fiscal capacity is absolutely central to having a politics of tax and transfer. If the state cannot credibly tax, it cannot redistribute. And wealthy may in fact not fear democratization if there is no underlying ability to tax. The paper also hinges on problematizing how we have come to think about capacity. We know from studies by both economists and political scientists that fiscal capacity is inordinately hard to build. In order to have good fiscal capacity, you need good infrastructural and informational capacity, which I think of broadly as bureaucratic capacity, because the state needs to know where you live, how much you make, how you try to hide your wealth, and when you don't pay your taxes, the state has to have the ability to shake you down and make you comply. And because this capacity is so hard to build, we often think of fiscal capacity as coming from these deep macro-historical processes like war making, or the long effects of colonialism, or as some accident of geography that's made it possible for the state to more effectively tax. But while capacity is hard to build, I argue that it's relatively easier to erode in the short run. And in order to make this claim, I look at a moment in colonial India where we see this weakening of taxation right around the time that elites of a specific type find themselves challenged. And here what you're looking at is land revenue contributions to total revenue in colonial India. Why are we looking at land revenue? Because this was the biggest source of taxation in colonial India at the turn of the century in the early 1900s. But right around the time when the British transferred this land taxation into the control of local provincial elites, you see a dip in the contribution of land revenue. And you see that it drops around 1916 to 1917. It reaches a bottom in 1920. And even though it tips back a little bit, it's not anywhere close to what it used to be in the previous century. And in this paper, I argue the reason for this is because not so much about alternative forms of taxation or the diminishing role of land, but that the state in itself has been weakened around this period to effectively collect the taxes that it previously was able to do so. So what you're looking at here are box plots of, on the y-axis, tax collection ratios, which is total taxes collected as a ratio of total taxes levied. And you can see that right until about 1916, 1917, the colonial state was doing a pretty good job of collecting taxes across the districts of colonial India. But right around 1918 onwards, there's much greater variation in how effectively the colonial state is collecting taxes. So over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to flesh out this idea that incumbent groups or elites may weaken fiscal capacity in anticipation of losing power, which usually happens around the time of a franchise expansion, which means the extension of the right to vote to groups that they're in contest with. I explore this idea by studying fiscal capacity in colonial India over a 13-year period. My empirical strategy is to utilize the quasi-exogenous nature of this franchise expansion that comes because of an announcement made by the British in 1917 to introduce limited reforms to Indians in the colonial Indian provinces, and using newly digitized data on tax collections, tax avoidance, and the size of the tax bureaucracy in colonial India, I will argue that fiscal capacity declined, but it declined not so much in the way, in places where we would think of as being characterized by high levels of economic inequality, but rather in places where there was much greater ethnic inequality around social status. And I'll extend the arguments that I derive from India to other cases, notably the American South at the end of the American Civil War. So let me begin first by fleshing out what this phenomenon of hollowing out is that I've described in the first few minutes. Hollowing out in practice is a series of steps that elites take to weaken the bureaucratic machinery of the state. And this happens in a variety of ways. It could happen through weak enforcement and compliance. It could happen through the reduction of the size of the tax bureaucracy. It could happen by weakening essential supporting agencies that are absolutely critical to effective taxation. And what are these? These could be the census. These could be agencies that train bureaucrats. These could be agencies that keep meticulous records of who makes what, and things like cadastral maps that give you information about land and the profitability of land. And it could be oversight agencies that are important to making sure that various facets of the tax bureaucracy function effectively. It could also be through legislation that ties the hands of future politicians to use taxation effectively. And now what I'm describing here is distinct from other ways in which political economists and economists have thought about taxation right around democratization or franchise expansion, notably Melzer and Richard, and models that derive from that, which focus on fiscal policy, which is, stylized tax rates, or even the composition of different types of taxation, right? So thinking about what capacity is needed for taxation is a different lens than looking at fiscal policy, which assumes that the state can in fact tax. And it's also different from ways in which, political scientists and sociologists have thought about how institutional weakening or weaknesses occur, notably as corruption or entrenching influence or drifting or converting institutions to do things that they haven't typically done in the past. So hollowing out, I argue, is a distinct institutional phenomenon that needs to be studied. And so this then relatedly raises, why does hollowing out happen? Do we always observe it, or do we need a specific set of conditions around which hollowing out emerges? So we can think about conditions that might encourage hollowing out. These might occur when, incumbent elites or groups are seeking to protect wealth particularly wealth that's captive, like land or fixed assets, and elites who fear expropriation after democracy or a franchise expansion might be particularly keen to manipulate the capacity of the state to tax in order to protect those immobile assets. We might also think about non-economic reasons like ethnic or religious identities that might encourage the ways in which groups seek to entrench and limit, redistribution, entrench their power and limit redistribution in the future. But here in this paper, I take those as a starting point, but then I say, let's think through what sort of politics you might need to really make fiscal weakening succeed, because this is quite a dramatic sort of set of strategies to use, because the state works for everyone, not just the poor, right? So fiscal weakening is more likely to succeed, I argue, when circumstances can encourage a cross-class coalition, a coalition where both wealthy and poor voters start to fear future state policies or begin to view the state with suspicion. And so I argue, we can think about economic inequality, we can think about ethnic or religious fragmentation, but fiscal weakening, I argue, historically, we are more likely to see occur in context of high social or social status inequality. And in these places, high rank or high status groups fear not only redistribution, but also social integration. And so in this paper, beyond documenting the following phenomenon of hollowing out the state, I also offer that hollowing out most likely succeeds where you have these political conditions that foment such an extreme strategy of weakening the state to have your way. And here I argue that, we typically think about taxation as being predicted by income contestation between wealthy and poor groups. But when you layer on it status competition, which could be orthogonal to income, that is really where you will see hollowing out occur, which I argue is its own sort of axis on which politics can turn. And so why does social status matter or social inequality matter to fiscal weakening? So first of all, let me talk about the class of cases where you can see this. And so here I argue that social inequality or social status distinctions arise in what we think of as ranked social systems. And democratization in these contexts is a challenge to pre-existing social order. So examples of ranked systems exist around the world as a legacy of slavery, aristocracy, caste, apartheid, or even the Mibun system in Tokugawa, Japan. And in these contexts, you have both wealthy and poor high-ranked members who resist any attempts at democracy bringing in a desegregation of public goods or an integration of distinct social groups. And these high-ranked members face both a psychic or psychological threat because they fear the loss of holding a high rank, and they also fear the state because it can undertake social integration, erasing traditional rank boundaries between groups. And so in these cases, when high rank groups feel threatened, and in context of high social status inequality, both wealthy and poor high rank individuals are susceptible to anti-tax, anti-statist coalitions. And they express this feeling of hostility to state endeavors to tax by increasing the level of non-compliance to the state, increasing resistance to any kind of attempts by the state to collect information about these populations. And overall, this results in an increased suspicion of the state and its policies amongst these high-ranked poor. And so, in addition to working on colonial India, I also have related research on places around the world where this kind of status politics emerges to hollow out the state. And one such paper I recently wrote about, which has come out in the American Political Science Review, is one that documents this phenomenon in the American South. And here, you have the words of a South Carolina Republican in 1868 at the end of the Civil War saying, sensitivity manifested by yeoman scalawags about strident pressure for social equality, I have always maintained that whenever the question comes a matter of color, I would be obliged to take sides of my own color. So here, this South Carolina Republican is weighing legislative demands for greater civil and social equality with the pressures of maintaining racial status distinctions between Blacks and whites. And this has led to prior social scientists, notably Du Bois, understanding that social inequality and status inequality are very important determinant of political coalitions and state outcomes. And Du Bois notes that despite these divergent economic interests, whites were united by the shibboleth of race. So as I move from setting out the stage and telling you what the question of this paper is and what my main hypotheses are, and into the empirical part of this paper, let me just reiterate the following. In the next empirical section that follows, I'm going to test this hypothesis that I've laid out, that first, something called hollowing out occurs around democratization of franchise expansion. And second, hollowing out is more likely to be observed in contexts of higher social status inequality. And in these places, a franchise expansion will be associated with greater levels of fiscal weakening or hollowing out. And I'm going to put this main hypothesis in contrast with alternative explanations, such as higher wealth inequality will shape greater levels of fiscal weakening, and greater ethnic competition will be associated with greater levels of fiscal weakening in anticipation of franchise expansion. Now, before I move to the empirical part, let me lay out two challenges that I think plague any argument one makes about something like social inequality or inequality mattering to the development of the state. The first and foremost is franchise expansion itself might be endogenous to how the state looks or how strong the state is. So franchise expansion might be endogenous to fiscal capacity. Maybe franchise expansion occurs more easily when elites don't fear taxation. And so it's a hard way to test what came first, as Maris and Peralt have pointed out in a recent paper on how elites might manipulate capacity to defer democracy. The second is, as you've heard me talk about status, and I'm sure it has come to you, where you think about how is it possible to imagine a world where status is in fact not something that comes without economic resources, right? So in your mind, you might say, okay, she talked about the American case, but isn't it also true that historically white populations have been much wealthier than Black populations? And so how do we disentangle any argument that hinges on social versus economic distinctions between groups? And so this is where the case that I study becomes really interesting, which is the case of franchise expansion and fiscal capacity in colonial India. And why is this a good case? Well, first of all, franchise expansion arrived from the outside. So the British, largely at the behest of one singular character in 1916, 1917 India, which is the Secretary of State for India, Edwin Montagu, makes an impassioned speech in the British Parliament and pushes for franchise extension to provincial Indians. The second is India's caste system, which I'll talk about a little bit more in further down, is a case where status and economic inequality don't neatly coincide. So it's possible for us to think about how social distinctions between groups and social inequality between groups shape outcomes in a way that's possible to put the economic versus status considerations and see what is doing the work, right? So franchise expansion in colonial India comes, as I said, after this announcement in 1917 in the British Parliament to introduce limited franchise to Indians. This led to the right to vote to tax-paying residents in the provinces, extending the franchise to anywhere between 1.5% to 5% of provincial Indians. And this led to elections in 9 directly administered colonial Indian provinces in November 1920. And in this paper, I examine the trajectory of districts within two colonial provinces, the Bombay and Madras, which together cover about 43 districts between 1914 to 1925. And I look at these two particular provinces because, first of all, they had very similar land tenure systems, which was very important for taxation in that era. For those of you who are familiar with the Banerjee and Iyer piece on land tenure systems, this is what we call the tenant manage or owner proprietor systems or Rayatwari systems. So the districts in these two provinces have these Rayatwari systems where the owners were themselves the land tillers, or at the very least, they rented to tenants, contrasting with large landholding systems like the zamindari systems, of which there are very few in these districts. And together, these 43 districts today account for about 250 million Indian citizens, and knowing something about these 43 districts over this time period gives us clues about ways in which Indian politics has developed. And very importantly for my case, I adopt this sort of examination of taxation across a period over a decade, because I really want to focus on what happened, not just before elections, but between the time of the franchise extension announcement to the first election, which was a 3-year window for incumbent elites to tinker with capacity of the state. So looking at it over time gives us a picture of what exactly happened to tax institutions in this period, right around the time of the franchise extension announcement. So let me lay out the timeline of what exactly goes down. Prior to 1920, which would be the first election, land taxation, as I told you, was the biggest source of tax revenue, was a central or imperial subject. The provinces got to keep half of the revenues they raised, and then they had to kick the rest up to the British Crown. The spending of these taxes was entirely controlled by the British bureaucrats, and Indians up until 1920 had very little say politically in terms of how the British state could prioritize that spending. Their powers were limited to nominated councils, and they were almost always outnumbered by the British in the same council. After 1920, land taxes would become an entirely provincial subject. Provinces kept all the revenues they raised, and elected legislators controlled all the spending decisions, which is the newly elected Indians who would be in these councils. And importantly, while the elected legislators couldn't set the tax rate, which was still an imperial subject, the elected legislators controlled all the decisions relating to the tax infrastructure. The bureaucrats would now have to go to the elected legislators for their budget. The bureaucrats would now be answerable to these elected legislators. So in this paper, I look at exactly what do incumbent groups do in anticipation of this franchise extension. And so I come back to that figure. You know, if you're looking at the start of this figure, that's where the franchise extension announcement is happening, that dotted line. And 1920 is where the first election takes place, which is the second dotted line. And you see that decline in land taxation. And again, 1917 is the year in which Montagu makes his announcement, and you see the disturbances in tax collection rates start across the provinces after that. And so now we come to trying to understand how we can parse wealth versus social inequality as explanations for why this variation in tax collections occurred, right? So first, let me lay out for you what social inequality or status inequality looks like in colonial India. So as many of you are aware, Hindu Indians are part of what is called a caste system, where you are born into a specific caste identity. And the British census in that period tabulated the extent to which Indians were socially distinct in these caste categories. So right at the top, we have what they call the Hindu advanced. Each of these are census categories used by the British in early 1900s India. So the Hindu advanced included castes or subcastes, which were Brahmins, which are the priestly castes. The Hindu forward and Hindu intermediate are actually very wealthy caste groups. They are the castes that control industry and agriculture. Then the Hindu backward and the Hindu depressed, which are your untouchables, are your castes that work in labor-intensive and menial jobs in this period. And then you have castes within Muslims and castes that live on their own in, tribal hamlets, which were known as primitive tribes. And the reason I show these two ways of looking at caste is, if you were to adopt the lens of thinking about caste as an ethnic identity, then you would think about, jatis or subcastes, of which there are 430 enumerated castes just in the Madras presidency, with district level information on about 113 of them. But if you were to adopt a status lens, which is to think about caste as an order of social ranking in Indian society, not unlike aristocracy or the Mibun system in Japan, then you get a slightly different picture of what group-based competition looked like in this period, which is these big status categories. And so here, going back to that picture I showed you, I'm going to be examining through empirical analysis the competition that arises between these top three categories in this particular picture on the right. The high caste category, which is the high status group, which is not very wealthy, but the Hindu forward and Hindu intermediate, which are your lower status categories, but which have high wealth and wealth standing in society. So I'm trying to understand what status versus income competition between these groups does to tax outcomes in this era. And so who were the high-ranked status groups in this period? The high-ranked status groups, as I said, the Hindu advanced, were Brahmins. They were less than 10% of the population in the districts of these provinces, but yet had more than 60 to 90% of control of the state. They are not the landowners. They are instead priests, teachers, lawyers, petty bureaucrats, tax collectors. And these Brahmins controlled very important arms of the British state as lower level bureaucrats. They formed about 93% of deputy collectors. Roughly 2/3 of the judicial and 80% of educational or public works departments were Brahmins. 60% of the revenue department, which was key to collecting taxes, were Brahmins in this period. Now, in contrast to the high status, high rank group, who were the wealthy groups? Now, these, as I mentioned, were the landowning and mercantile castes. They were wealthy, but they were considered socially inferior to Brahmins. And they were eager for franchise reforms so they could undertake desegregation from everything from drinking water wells to schools to temples and the management of religious charities. They were really keen to introduce affirmative action in order to increase their representation in schooling and in the colonial bureaucracy. And they were really keen to undermine Brahmin dominance in both high levels and low levels of the British bureaucracy, as well as Brahmin dominance in everyday social interactions in their social lives. And so coming back to how all of this matters to hollowing out the state, in that 3-year period between 1918 to 1920, I argue that Brahmins weakened the tax machinery at the time of franchise. They attempt to reduce the size of the tax bureaucracy, and they enact legislation that can limit taxation in the future. And what I'm going to show you next is empirical evidence of the first two things, which is how they go for the tax machinery and the size of the tax bureaucracy. And so now we move to the data section of this project. And here I'm going to be relying on a data set that I built using colonial era records on land taxation, land inequality, the caste information that I just showed you to develop measures of social inequality, ethnic and caste fragmentation. And of course, this comes from multiple types of archival sources like land revenue reports, land holding reports, the census of 1921 and 1931, public instruction reports, and also the words and ideas of the men of this time, which come from legislative deliberation in this period. And so in order to measure hollowing out and taxation and bureaucratic capacity, I measured 3 things, which I think all lead to the same idea of trying to figure out how to go after the bureaucratic capacity of the state to tax. The first is the measure you're familiar with that was in the graph earlier, which is the ratio of taxes collected as a proportion of total tax demanded in a period. So this every year tells me how effectively the British state is actually doing the job of collecting taxes that it's levying. The second measure is a related one to the tax collection one, which is the extent of district level tax avoidance, which is measured as the number of demand notices sent to tax defaulters annually. And the third, in case you might worry that measures 1 and 2, in fact, in themselves reflect good capacity because, hey, if you're able to detect tax non-compliance, you're doing something well. I look at a more micro measure of bureaucratic capacity as the numbers of municipal level employees working on collecting taxes and how that changed between the time of franchise extension to a decade later, which is the number of municipal level employees working in these districts in this period between these 2 decades. In order to measure social status and contrast it to wealth inequality, I first create your standard measure of wealth inequality as a Gini coefficient of land holdings in these districts. Second, as a measure of social status inequality, I really try to think about ways in which high castes in India exerted their social control. And here I hone in on the fact that Brahmins, as the priestly castes historically, made literacy so central to their identity in order to be able to read religious texts, and create a measure where I calculate the extent to which Brahmins are overrepresented in the literate population relative to their share in the actual population. And it's really critical for me to emphasize here that literacy was not a key way to acquire wealth in this era. Literacy was, if you wanted to make money, you bought land and worked on land or engaged in trade or commerce. You did not try to educate yourself to a high extent in order to get ahead in early 1900s India. And so to me, this idea of social inequality is quite nicely captured by the extent to which Brahmins overconsume literacy as a resource relative to other castes. I also measure just straight up Brahmin proportions in the population as another way to think about how much status matters in these districts. And I control for a variety of the alternative explanations that include, ethnic fragmentation, tax burdens, district and year effects in this time series data. So the punchline here, what you see is before the franchise extension announcement, Brahmin dominance, which is this variable of how much Brahmins are overrepresented in the literate population relative to their share, actually has a slightly positive effect on the extent of tax collections in these districts. And right after the franchise extension announcement, there is now a negative correlation. And that negative correlation is slightly stronger in just those reform era period between 1918 to 1920. And so in order to see if this pattern holds in a regression framework, I use a multi-level model with district and year, with units nested within districts and years, and use a varying intercepts model by district and year. And there are some very specific reasons why I adopt this model, because many of my measures are time invariant and district invariant. And just to put it out there, all of these results also hold for just your bog standard ordinary least squares with fixed effects by province and district and errors clustered by year. And so what do I find? The results of my multi-level models show that greater land inequality, which was the alternative explanation, is associated with a decrease in tax collection rates and an increase in tax avoidance after the reform announcement. But importantly, greater Brahmin dominance is associated with the same, a decrease in tax collection and an increase in tax avoidance. and particularly so in the reform era between 1918 to 1920. So here you can see that, a 1 standard deviation increase in Brahmin dominance on average would lead to about a 13% decline in taxation or tax collection rates in the period after the reform. And similar patterns hold also for the reform era. Now, wealthy landlords might have weakened capacity is the first thing you might think of. And they might have done it with the help of Brahmins in their districts, as some kind of a collusion strategy of using bureaucrats to their own advantage. In my paper, I talk about this as the leading sort of explanation for what happened in colonial India, which is a desire to appeal to what are called agrarian vote banks. Agrarian vote banks being wealthy landlords who can whip up voters to the polling booth in return for keeping their interests, protected by the state. But in fact, what we find here, separating out high and low land inequality districts, is that Brahmin dominance and Brahmin size was associated with lower tax collection, even in low land inequality districts. And this is really powerful. In fact, what you find is that social inequality comes to matter in contexts of pretty low wealth inequality between caste groups, which really makes the case for how social standing comes to shape, tax outcomes. Beyond these basic tests, I also contrast a couple of other explanations. One might be that despite largely focusing on districts which have Rayatwadi or non-landlord systems, there are some areas of both these presidencies that did have, landlord systems. So just making sure that that's not driving the results. I find that Brahmin dominance is still substantively large and robust in these models. And finally, really, this is the punchline for me, which is OLS models that show a decline, modeling the decline in municipal employment. And here, it's very clear that the decline in municipal employment was associated with social inequality, and no similar results held for land inequality. Now, what are some of the implications of what I have found? Now, canonical models predict that when there's an expansion of the franchise, you should see an expansion of taxation, primarily because now the median voter is likely to be poorer and their preferences come to bear on how taxation develops. But in reality, this hasn't happened in many contexts. And so here, going from this very micro study of districts in provinces in colonial India, I tentatively offer that the franchise expansion to taxation link can be broken if groups target fiscal capacity. And so in order to test that, I look at another case, which I mentioned earlier on, which is the case of the American South, where whites targeted bureaucratic capacity after the Civil War. And here, again, I do some granular work on how taxation develops in the counties of the former 11 Confederate states. And here what we observe is formerly enslaved areas, counties with high levels of former enslaved populations, do a much better job of collecting taxes when there's federal oversight during the 1870s. And then they work to reverse that when local elites gain power, leading to a decline in taxation. And importantly, it's not just taxation, it's things like the quality of the census, which are so key to effective taxation because of bureaucratic quality, that are also affected. So here, what I'm showing you is a measure called age heaping, which is the extent to which there's noise in the census around how well you're collecting information about the age of your populations. And at the county levels, age heaping amongst whites grows in formerly enslaved areas, once again telling you something about the extent to which the state performing poorly in contexts of high social inequality. And so with that, I'd like to conclude by saying that if there's anything that you should take away from my talk is that, there's an overwhelming assumption about the importance of materiality and material competition between groups that shapes redistribution. But the colonial Indian case, and to some extent the US case, shows that sometimes competition is not so much over material redistribution, the competition is over social integration and social rank. And so challenges to social rank, I've shown, might shape taxation, but they could also shape support for redistribution and support for who people vote for, like right-wing party support amongst the poor. And in more recent work, I've started to tap into the sort of micro psychological foundations of how we should start to think about status as an identity and what it does for people in terms of how they view politics and the state. And so here I've started to explore the micro foundations of status politics as an identity category, which I'm happy to talk about if people are interested in the Q&A. So with that, thank you. And I look forward to your questions.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. This is really fascinating. I enjoyed reading the paper, and your presentation was, if anything, nicer. I have a couple of questions which really reflect, I'm not apologizing, I just want you to take these as naive questions, an ignorance of both this literature and the Indian context. One of them is, it seems to me like you found a really interesting example where the people in charge aren't the elites. I mean, the people with the highest status aren't the richest, right? Now, that seems like a very unusual kind of circumstance. And I guess you could interpret my question as external validity, but I don't mean it that way. What I mean is just how often, do you think that everything which you can't test here would be similar in a context where the elites are actually also the rich people?
Right. So I think that's a very fair question, and one that I have encountered before. So in my larger book project, my first thing was to try and find other contexts where this is true. And so the first thing that I have encountered is the case of Tokugawa Japan, where the Mibun system looks a lot like the caste system. And I'm looking at how, historical patterns of samurai dominance might have done the same in Japan as they've done in India. So at the very least, I can say, tentatively, the same sort of idea of a group that's high in status, not being the wealthiest, does replicate to other contexts that are not just the Indian caste system. But I think the more important thing here is for me to show you that this happens when I can put status and class next to each other, but you see status politics at play amongst the poor of high status groups in many contexts across the world. So back to cases like whites in South Africa, or whites in the US, I think this particular study gives intuitions into what exactly is in the mind of poor whites in the US and why they care for status, which I think applies widely across a range of cases where status and class do overlap. And so just looking at India gives you evidence that status is doing the work on its own, but its lessons apply more broadly to any sort of ranked ethnic or ranked social systems in understanding the motivations of poor members of high status groups.
Now, I have a follow-on question before we get to, there's some other questions coming up. This is, if I understand correctly, this is an unusual circumstance too, in the sense that the Brahmins, they sort of are the state, right? I mean, they're the bureaucrats. I often think of political economy as you have the voters decide what they want, and then they hire bureaucrats to execute. Here, you have this high status group with this independent source of authority because you can't do anything without their agreement. So again, do you find that in other contexts or not?
Yeah, so this is I think this is a little bit more problematic than your first question, right? Which is, where are the circumstances where you have a high status group that can also actually have the ability to manipulate the state? And there, I think beyond the cases of the Indian provinces or Indian districts, that might be a little harder one to find. But, again, I try to get at this using the American case. And if any of you have the opportunity to look at my paper there, the last section of that paper is really dedicated to looking at census collectors and what census collectors in the American South are doing around the 1880 census, and where they're doing a good job and where they're doing a bad job. And here, contexts where there's high social inequality or racial inequality between Blacks and whites, census collectors are doing a bad job. And where there's very low inequality on a social level, census collectors are doing a much better job. And so, that paper allows me to show how social and economic inequality interact in funny ways to shape state outcomes. And so, yes, you're right that the Brahmins controlling the British state, on the one hand, gives very rich information about how a high status group operates. But again, I think extends to how we think about the hearts and minds of local bureaucrats in contexts characterized by status differences.
Now, we've also got some questions asking you, and this is more speculative, of course, to think about sort of a broader cross-sectional dimension in India. And then also is that you've chosen 2 of 9 provinces, which are directly ruled. And you've chosen those 2 because the other ones don't have this particular reliance on a land tax, correct?
Timothy, I'm losing you. I lost the last 20 seconds of what you asked. I'm sorry.
My understanding, you've chosen these 2 of 9 provinces because they're particularly reliant on this land tax, correct?
Yeah.
If you thought, can you say anything at all about
that? Yes. Actually, the case that is really interesting to me and one that I am looking at as a qualitative case study in relation to Madras and Bombay is West Bengal, right? And so if you think about the 3 major presidencies of the British in this period, it was Madras, Bombay, and Bengal. And Bengal is interesting because the Bengal has big landlord systems, the zamindari systems. And it's also interesting because their bureaucrats are not Brahmins. They are a caste called Kayasthas. And the Kayasthas are actually lower status, but educated. And so one of the things I'm trying to argue is that you don't see the same pattern of fiscal weakening in Bengal, precisely because the state is not controlled by Brahmins. And 2, the landlord interests are very much interests that are different from the sort of tenant-owned system. So both the economic and the cultural or social axes diverge in Bengal with very different outcomes.
Okay, and then we also got a question about modern India, which I realize is more speculative for you. But obviously, modern India has worked very hard to undo some of the effect of caste. Do you think that has any effect on the functioning of the modern state?
Yeah, in many ways, my historical study was actually inspired by the work of sociologists and anthropologists studying modern India. So I want to give a big shout out to anybody who's interested in Jeffrey Witzow's work, who studies contemporary Bihar. And he talks about the difficulties of a lower caste chief minister's ability to get anything done by upper caste bureaucrats in the state. And so even though politics had changed and a lower caste chief minister had come into power, he was hitting up against this intransigence of the state in not being able to do anything with that power, which resulted in him using, other ways in which to get things done for his groups. And so it made me start to think about what happens when, the preferences of high castes and low castes diverge, and the extent to which how much politics versus the bureaucracy matter to outcomes. And in some ways, 1920 Madras and Bombay were Bihar in that period, where you have lower castes coming into power. They're going to win the elections. They are the more dominant populations. They have the money, but they can't do anything because of these high caste groups that have been using the state for their own sort of social purposes. And what happens when these 2 go up against each other?
Rui has a question, and I think he's unmuted himself here.
Yes, I have. Thank you very much, Pavitra. This is fascinating stuff. My questions are mostly clarification. So first one, tax substitution, right? So there's a dramatic decrease. You interpret it totally on the side of holding out tax capacity. Can you say something else? What was happening to the overall tax structure?
Yeah.
The same. So you have this funny intersection between the political class that is actually not the elite, as Tim mentioned earlier on. There are other examples that you can find in history. People have written big political economic stories of this distinguishing between economic and political losers. For instance, in the case of the UK, right? So the traditional landowning elite.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So you can totally relate.
Totally, yeah.
You can totally relate to those ones. And then the other clarification question. So one of your measures of fiscal capacity wholly got thereof was the relation between total tax collected and total tax demanded.
Mm-hmm.
Were these tax demands stable or were they endogenous, right? So whoever determined, who was determining these tax demands, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let me start with that last question first, Rui. The way in which the tax demand was set was in permanently settled districts, which means where you've decided permanently what the demand is, they remained incredibly stable. In others, what you had was your periodic revenue resettlement surveys, which means every 10 years or so, the British state went in with its surveyors to try and get a sense of how productive land was in these places and whether it needed to periodically update its schedule of, how much to demand per acre in this period. And so what's fascinating is some of the qualitative material I get into in my book chapters tell a story of how these Brahmins also target an end to resettlement surveys. So the first thing they do is they try to legislate around permanently suspending revenue resettlement surveys so that they can target the denominator in this equation. And so what happens is already this denominator is relatively stable. It doesn't change for like 5 to 10 year periods. But what now that means is that denominator remains stable for even longer periods of time, right? And you're totally right that, the political and economic sort of contestation, the UK case is very good in the sense that you see this in the status politics of the aristocracy versus the newly nascent bankers and merchants of England and how much that's shaping political coalitions and contestation over policies. So that's definitely a case that is totally makes sense. Yeah.
Are there other questions at this point? Well, I have a sort of nerdy question, which I'm embarrassed to ask, but I'll ask it anyway.
Oh, Tim, before you move on, Rui also asked a question about tax substitution. And one thing I wanted to point out was, yes, income taxes and indirect taxes in the form of customs duties were a pretty substantial and growing part. So one way in which you can interpret that first graph I showed you, which is a decline, could be that, okay, income taxes are growing, but my hope is to put that story alongside the story of, weakening tax collections to tell you that, actually there's a there. So sorry about that, Tom.
No, of course, and it would have to be district variant, right?
Yes.
So otherwise it would just be absorbed by the fixed effects.
Exactly.
Okay, my nerdy question is that maybe you've done this someplace, but you've divided your into 3 periods, right? Is there a specification where you just let every year be different and then do the hypothesis test to see that you've actually identified the right subperiods?
Yes. Yeah. So one is to run, so I also try to just get the coefficient on the same thing and sort of plot the coefficient by year. So if you can do a mental map, it looks something like this. So it increases, which is the coefficient on the status variable, predicts tax inequality, tax avoidance in the reform era and then less so in others. And then it spikes again every election. So 20, it's sharper. And then 23, again, it's sharper because that's the next set of elections. So again, there's a micro story of how they're reusing this strategy for every electoral cycle.
Now, David Mitch, I hope I've done this correctly. David Mitch had something he wanted to ask, and I think I just unmuted him. David, did I unmute you?
Did I?
Yes, you did.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. I was starting to type it in. Yeah. So first of all, I found this a very interesting, worthwhile presentation. So thank you very much. I find it generally convincing. 2 sort of simple questions come to mind. One is sometimes in these tax models, there's use of ends versus middle coalitions. And so the idea is the very elites and the very poor get together because the poor don't want to pay either. And I was wondering if there could be elements of that were going on in the situation where the people at the bottom are joining in with the hollowing out because they view victimization. So that's one of my questions. The other question is in going back to the Banerjee and Iyer finding, the Rayatwari areas, typically they find longer term that those areas are very good at the local level in developing coalitions for public goods provision and so on. And that would have the implication that eventually they could offset what was going on by these elite groups. And I was just wondering about that element at work as well. So those
Yeah.
are my two questions.
Okay, those are both terrific questions. So the first thing I would say is in the Indian case, what we're talking about is a limited franchise extension. So these are groups that are middle to upper income. So there are no poor in this, right? So here, what you're trying to see and understand are the motivations of who will become the middle class voters versus the upper class. So that in itself is sort of gives an interesting intuition to how the emerging middle, when the full franchise extension happens, who is it going to align itself with? The emerging middle, when it's upper caste, aligns itself with it kind of economic thinking of economically wealthy groups. The Rayatwadi areas are long-term good performers, but the way I am pushing this argument suggests that the reason those might be is because those Rayatwadi areas might also have certain kinds of caste structures that make them different. So Bombay and Madras, which are the big Rayatwadi areas, are also areas in which Brahmins are substantially lower numbers. So they're about 6 to 8% of the population in these provinces. And so over time, these Rayatwadi areas come to be good at development, I think, because low status and low rank groups are the ones that call the political shots. And over time, they have changed the character of the bureaucracy. So if you look at the character of the bureaucracy and the Tamil or the Kerala or Telugu parts of the country or the Maratha parts of the country, they are now lower caste too. So it could be an alternative explanation for why Rayatwadi districts are good is because they actually have a social contract that emphasizes development for all, and its high status members have been sidelined in a way that has not been possible in landlord areas. And so that's a little bit more new terrain for me. I'm just putting that out there. It's not something I'm testing here or showing, but it's an alternative way to think about where development in Rayatwadi districts has come from.
Okay, I should say that I've missed a couple of people who wanted to be unmuted, and I'll do that. But first, let me ask a question. Nathan Sussman claims he's on a train. I'm skeptical of that. But in any case, his question is, are the results here in any way affected by the fact that India was under colonial rule, so you could hollow out the state without affecting any security concerns?
This is a good one, which is, how do you imagine other things like law and order being affected by hollowing out? And to be frank, I don't have an answer to this. It's possible that hollowing out was a strategy more plausible because elites didn't worry that they would be in a bad law and order situation because the British were there to take care of that side of things. But here, that's why I think it's helped to do this study again in a non-Indian context, which is not colonial, which is, again, the counties of the American South. And there you see that it still happens, right? So it's a strategy that's not particularly happening only in a colonial context where things like law and order have become somebody else's problem, so elites can play in a terrain that they wouldn't normally do so. But it's a good one, and I hope this was a satisfying answer. Okay.
Well, we have time for one more question before the formal end. So I think I have unmuted Lenka Rabatinova, and we can have the last question.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's really interesting. And I just wanted to know, I think you already touched it, like what is it like today? How the regional Punjabi versus Bengal, how do they compete today? Where is this competition going?
This is a great question because so much of the politics of the BJP is upper caste politics, right? So, and the only modern day, again, US comparison I can make is it's very Trumpian. It has a very solid support amongst the upper castes of India. The BJP can do no wrong. They will always vote for it. And the BJP cabinet right now is the most Brahmin cabinet we've had in decades. Like there are almost hardly any lower caste members in the cabinet. And you see that, again, with the BJP coming to power, it's gone after institutions. You see institutional weakening happening in real time, and it's happening with the Indian civil service, administrative service. You see it happening with tax institutions, and you see it happening not unlike in ways that I've described in colonial India. So I would say, social status politics remains very relevant in contemporary India and remains especially relevant to the support base of the modern day BJP.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. This is the formal end of the session, so we stop after an hour formally, but we will continue for 15 minutes informally. Before we do that, Ray would be very angry with me for not telling you about coming attractions. So next week, the talk will be by Eric Monet, Angela Riva, and Stefano Ungaro, and the title of the talk is The Real Effects of Bank Runs, Evidence from the French Great Depression, 1930 to 1931. So I'm sure that many of you want to come around for that. So what we'll do now is we'll just continue as we were before, but this is a formal end, and if you have to go off and do something else, then we all understand. But if you have more questions at this point, let me know. I'm sorry I've missed a couple of you just because I'm not very good at this, but let me know if you want me to unmute you so you can ask more questions. We'll stay until like 12:15, my time, 15 more minutes, whatever time that is for you.
Since this is informal, can I come in back again? So I understand the need for a source of exogenous variation, right, which you described as a completely out of the blue impassioned discourse in Whitehall, right? So this colonial administrator interested in extending franchise. But can you say a little bit more about that exclusion restriction?
Yeah,
so because I know a little bit that, the colonial authorities were trying to promote different status groups onto the, the Indian economic scene and eventually onto the political one as well. So was it completely exogenous?
Yeah. So first thing I would say is, for the Congress Party in India by then had already existed for 20, 30 years, right? And so there had been like clamoring demands amongst Indians for greater representation that had been going on for decades. And in some ways, this was a slow bubbling pot. They got one set of very limited reforms in 1909, which was called the Morley-Minto reforms. There was, constant sort of elite discourse around how, Indians have shown themselves to be so loyal through World War I. Like, don't you think it's time for us to be taken more seriously? But be as they may, as that might be, the case, Montague plays this very sort of singular role in taking those demands seriously and advancing the case for Indians being represented in this specific way. So I think from whatever I have read in this period, whether it's reaction to his speech in the parliament or even reactions from British Indian governors who are handling these different provinces, it comes as a shock. They're like, okay, I know we've been talking about this, but how did this get so ahead that he's now up there saying that we're going to have elections in a few years? And Montague does a second thing too, which is it ties the franchise extension reforms to also administrative reforms in the Indian provinces, because along with giving the Indians right to vote, they now sit down and articulate what are the domains in which Indians have power and what are the domains in which the British have power and what are some shared subjects which they have to deliberate on simultaneously. And so while it's true that there are these longer patterns and there are groups on the Indian side, the very specific timing of this happening in August 1917, I think it still catches people on the back foot. And you see that in like the immediate discourse around how surprised people are by how much he's pushed this. And they were especially surprised that he was doing it right in the middle of World War I, which came for the British as a shock. It's like, don't we have enough to deal with that now you're adding this other thing on top of everything else? And so that's why I say it's quasi-exogenous is my claim in this period.
Thank you.
We got a question here, which is sort of a clarification. And I realize now I read the paper, and I think in the paper you address this, but maybe in the presentation, not so much. So I'll just prompt you and you can answer it again. The question was this: if the Brahmins don't own the land, why wouldn't they want the land tax to continue? Because they're making somebody else pay the tax. So why don't you just, I think in the paper you really do address that. Why don't you say something about that?
Well, I think the pivotal point is what those taxes are going to be spent on. Right? They don't get to call the shots on how that spending occurs. Now that will be done by the elected Indians in the provinces. And here the Brahmins see that, the non-Brahmin size works in their favor, like in the favor of the lower castes. And the lower caste demands are as follows. Educational desegregation, allowing lower caste kids into the same classrooms as Brahmins who have entirely monopolized education in this period. control of temples, control of sewage and residential projects, which have been relatively segregated. And so the Brahmins understand that those tax monies are very much going into redistribution, but redistribution that's tied to caste-based social integration. And so this is the crux of it. They're not the taxpayers, but they also understand that from being dominant tax beneficiaries in colonial India, where they could keep, social distinctions going, that state of affairs will not continue. And so that's the jump. So
an implication would be, even if the British just sent them a check, they wouldn't want it, right? Because,
yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, that may be a way to just say it.
Yeah. And you see this also, I haven't put that in the paper, but you see this in the explosion of private educational institutions in this period. There's an exit from anything that the state is providing. Suddenly, the Hindu sabhas are growing, and things that are entirely charitably funded by high caste groups for high castes is exploding.
Okay, now we've also gotten a question. People are now very interested in this bigger project. So could you tell us a bit more about the book? You've mentioned parts of it, but
yeah. So I started by writing a book on status, of which hollowing out was one outcome. But now I've made it a book on hollowing out. And so the Indian case, where you've seen this paper, is a key chapter. But what is really important in the book is also to show you the politics around it. So a couple of chapters get into what's happening around the elections. What are they fighting over in the first elections in these provinces? And what are they saying in the legislatures before and after these elections? So what was being said in the nominated councils? What is now being said in the first elected councils, and how the same cast of characters goes from being supportive of state capacity to starting like Tea Party activists in newly elected councils. So that there's one bundle of chapters there. And then there's a chapter on external validity just within India. So how far does this carry beyond Bombay and Madras to something like West Bengal, which shows a different set of characteristics? And then there's the external validity, which is the US chapter, which is how far do we take this argument if it's not on India? And then the book sort of concludes with, I've told you about hollowing out the state, but now let me conclude by a theory of status politics. What is it? What does it look like? And what are the implications of status politics beyond the state? How might it shape voting and political preferences? So it sort of teases out the next set of papers and projects I'm working on.
That sounds interesting. So if there's no more questions, I have a nerdy question again, but if there's no other questions, I'll go ahead and we can wait. You showed us quickly a thing about age heaping in the American South, and you're interpreting that as the quality of the census taker. I've done some demography stuff, and usually demographers interpret that as the people. Right? They don't know their ages. So you have is there a reason why you can sort of tell the demographers are missing a crucial point here?
Yeah. So one of the things that Stephen and I claim here is that the same age heaping happens more in some time periods than others within the same populations. And so while it may be that this is the lack of education or the lack of literacy of white populations in this period, it's also the case that within a decade, from 1870 to the 1880 census, you see a decline in the interests of the census collectors to do their jobs effectively. So there are all these anecdotes about how census collectors are just hanging around at the local cafe, just waiting to see who they can catch and just fill it out, rather than going door to door and sort of getting it done carefully, right? So within a decade, you see a much greater local capture of the bureaucrats, and the census collectors are not now the people identified by the federal government, of which there were many in the 1870 census. There were actually many Blacks too who did this job in the 1870 census in a way that didn't happen in the 1880. 1880 became a lot more about the local men aligned to local interests who were doing this job because it was a convenient way to line their pockets. And they were like, yeah, all right, we're done. And boom, the census goes.
So you're saying if you look at, like, you take a cohort, you're saying this cohort going from 1870 to 1880, they're less likely to know their age in 1880 than they were in 1870?
That's the claim, but we can't really test this because we don't have the full 1870 census. So I understand somebody in a new paper has just now done the full 1870 census too. But if we had a theory, that's exactly right, that the 1870 cohort will show much greater precision in age-related information. And you would see that decline in 1880, and it would be only in those places which had been historically enslaved and not others.
That is really interesting. Okay, I think we have another question here. Okay, David Mitch says, hollowing out strikes me as perhaps more of a short and intermediate run response and not necessarily a long run equilibrium. I want to think about this some more. Could you please comment?
Well, in terms of scope conditions, it is a short-term response. And a second type of scope condition is that it's a short-term response happening to democratic threat. So it is a set of strategies adopted by groups to sort of see what they can do to destabilize the path on which they are, right? And so how successful that is, I think but it absolutely is, in the way I describe it, a series of short-term steps taken to get you off an equilibrium path. It's a concerted effort to push you off so that you stay on a different path going forward.
This may be really off base, but you must see cases where you have a newly democratized country and the threat to them is the holdover bureaucracy, like from the former communist regime. So that's a different context than when they may want to hollow out the state, or at least, right. Is there any literature on that?
Yeah, I mean, there is literature on it, and this is something that I thought about as, is this the same as that, right? So there is a fair bit of writing around what happened to the former communist and Eastern European countries and whose interests remain entrenched in the bureaucracy and how. And so there's an entire literature on entrenching the interests of outgoing elites in a way that will continue to benefit them in a new economy or in a new state of business affairs, where certain firms are given better priorities, certain industries are given certain leeway because they represent the entrenched interests of a prior era. And here again, I think this is different because this is not interest politics. This is taking a hatchet to the state in its entirety. It's different from saying the state is useful, but I want it to be useful in a certain way, versus I don't want the state at all because I don't think it can serve anything good right now.
Well, I think we've come to the end of the informal discussion, and there seem to be no more questions. Let me say I've really enjoyed this, and let me thank Pavi for a nice paper and a nice presentation in response to questions. And let me once again plug next week, April 21. The Real Effects of Bank Runs, Evidence from the French Great Depression by Eric Monet, Angela Riva, and Stefano Ungaro at the same time and place as this meeting was. So thank you all for participating, and congratulations again on a fine research project.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Patty.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.